Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Overreach, How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise, by Susan Shirk, narrated by Teri Schnaubelt. Prologue. How China Lost the West. A new Cold War has already begun. It will be very different from the first Cold War, which pitted the United States against the Soviet Union until it dissolved in 1991. In this Cold War, the United States faces China, which is both a rival and a partner. With the former Soviet Union, the lines of separation were clear. With China, they are not. China and the United States are economically and socially interdependent, more so than the Soviet Union and the United States ever were. Yet the interconnections haven't prevented them from hurtling into hostility. Paradoxically, their interdependence could make the new Cold War more dangerous than the old one. How did things end up in this way? Over the past 40 years, China and the United States had gotten along remarkably well, despite the vast differences between their political systems and China's rapid rise as an economic and military rival. They wove a dense fabric of trade, investment, technology, education, and personal ties that benefited people in both countries. China's transformation into a manufacturing dynamo, with a huge appetite for oil, iron, copper, and other raw materials from Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East, helped narrow the global inequalities between wealthy and developing nations. International production chains based on economic advantage rather than on ideology created an incentive for all countries to get along with one another, creating the foundation for this long era of peace. Scientists and engineers born in China, America, and other countries worked side by side in U.S. research labs, making breakthrough discoveries. Students, tourists, and business people flowed back and forth across the Pacific. Today, China and America have become so fearful of one another that they are weaponizing their interdependence. Not even the common threat of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 could convince the two governments to coordinate their efforts. Indeed, the virus revealed just how hostile the relationship had become, particularly compared with how they cooperated to combat health threats such as SARS, 2004-5, the swine H1N1 flu, 2009-10, and Ebola, 2014-16. During the First Cold War, the Soviet Union and America overcame their mutual suspicion to lead the global effort to eradicate the scourge of smallpox. But when COVID-19 broke out, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump underestimated the threat and hid it from the public, and then, to deflect criticism, sacrificed any remaining shred of amity in the relationship by blaming each other for starting the disease and allowing it to spread. U.S. Senator Tom Cotton and Trump administration officials claimed that the virus may have originated from a leak in a Wuhan biological warfare laboratory, and Trump started calling it the Chinese virus. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijin accused U.S. Army athletes who participated in the October 2019 Military World Games of bringing the virus to Wuhan. When the Trump administration refused to lift tariffs on masks, gowns, and other medical protective devices imported from China, relations hit a low point. Hostilities became even more inflamed when Xi Jinping embraced Russian leader Vladimir Putin in a lengthy statement pledging their friendship without limit in February 2022 on the eve of the Beijing Winter Olympics and just weeks before Putin invaded Ukraine. When faced with a stark choice of whether to align China with Russia or the West, Xi acted out of autocratic affinity. Relations with America and Europe may never recover from China's backing of Russia's unprovoked war against the Ukrainian people. The more that China and America exploit their economic and technological leverage to pressure each other, the more each feels the need to reduce its vulnerability by decoupling their economies and technologies. Washington and Beijing have been punishing the other's companies as proxies for the governments, trading sanctions in a tit-for-tat battle that pummels both economies. Meanwhile, the governments are investing heavily to bring their production chains safely home or move them to a reliably friendly country. The consequences of decoupling would be costly. The Chinese and American economies constitute a very large share, 40%, of the world's economy. As the two countries accelerate their drives for economic and technological self-reliance, they are pressing other countries to join their bloc, forcing an either-or choice that most nations wish to avoid. China is now the top trading partner of most of the world's countries, many more than the United States. Decoupling has already begun to disrupt the global economy. Even before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, global growth in 2019 was the lowest in a decade. Detaching the Chinese and American innovation ecosystems could imperil humanity's scientific advances. Many of the discoveries that improve and save lives are the work of teams of scientists and engineers from both countries. American life scientists have more collaborations with China than any other country. China and the United States are at the center of the global network of coronavirus research. As COVID-19 broke out, they increased their bilateral research partnerships. The new Cold War is being waged in economic, technological, political, and informational spheres, not on the battlefield. China hasn't engaged in outright military aggression since its brief war with Vietnam in 1979. Still, as the relationship between China and the U.S. deteriorates, the risk that an accident or misunderstanding could escalate into a shooting war also grows. China's growing military might undergird its ambitions. During the First Cold War, Berlin, divided by an Iron Curtain between the democratic West and the communist East, was the regional flashpoint, one that had symbolic value to the legitimacy of both sides and where the contest of wills between the two nuclear powers played out. Asia has even more flashpoints, places where Chinese and U.S. forces might find themselves in direct confrontation. The Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, the East China Sea between China and Japan, and the Korean Peninsula. First, the Taiwan Strait. An attack by the People's Republic of China, PRC, on Taiwan, the island democracy that the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has always claimed as part of China, would be viewed by the United States as a threat to the peace and security of the region and legally require the president to consult with Congress on its response. China's military has grown stronger, and its government has cut off dialogue with Taiwan. As a result, the possibility of an attack has increased. So has congressional support for Taiwan. The 2001 Congress introduced 38 bills to support Taiwan. The United States has approximately 100,000 soldiers deployed in the Asia-Pacific to defend our allies and deter aggression. If the United States doesn't defend Taiwan against an unprovoked attack, American credibility and its support for democracy would be seriously damaged. The South China Sea has also turned into a potential flashpoint between the two powers. Since 2006, China has been using force to press its expansive claims over the South China Sea and the tiny Spratly and Paracel Islands within it. These claims are contested by Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei. Taiwan makes the same claims as China. China accelerated its effort to establish its control over the area when it built more than 3,000 acres of artificial islands on 7 reefs and islets during 2014 and 2015. At a summit meeting in 2015, Xi publicly assured President Obama that China had no intention of militarizing the artificial islands, but the People's Liberation Army continued to build up installations on the outposts nevertheless. At the same time, China expanded its so-called gray zone harassment of other claimants by the Coast Guard and fishing boat militia. An international law tribunal rejected China's historic claims over almost the entire sea in 2016 in a ruling that China ignores and flouts. Meanwhile, the navies of the United States and other countries, treating the sea as international waters, conduct military exercises and transits through them. Tanker traffic through the South China Sea, most of it transporting oil and gas from the Middle East to Northeast Asia, constitutes more than half the global transport of these vital resources. a collision or altercation in the sea could escalate into a naval battle that draws in the United States. In the East China Sea, antagonism between China and Japan could embroil the United States in a clash. China and Japan both claim 5 tiny uninhabited islands and 3 rocks, called Senkaku in Japan and Diaoyu in China, that are located between the two countries in an area with undersea oil and gas reserves. The waters surrounding the islands have become crowded with Coast Guard patrol vessels and fishing boats from both sides. China has sent its aircraft carrier and other Navy ships into the Western Pacific through the East China Sea, and Chinese Air Force jets increasingly scramble over it. Although Washington doesn't officially take sides on the territorial claim, it has committed to come to Japan's defense if the islands are attacked by China. Should Chinese and Japanese politicians, pushed by public opinion, allow the next maritime incident to spin out of control, U.S. naval vessels could be ordered in. Finally, China's unpredictable neighbor and ally, North Korea, could force it into a war with the United States. Decades-long negotiations and international sanctions have failed to convince the North Korean regime to abandon its nuclear weapons program, and it has accelerated its missile testing program to the point where it will soon be able to reach the continental United States with an intercontinental ballistic missile. If North Korea collapses, or the United States attacks a North Korean missile launch pad or its nuclear facilities in order to preempt an attack on Japan, South Korea or the United States itself, China and the United States could find themselves fighting in a second Korean War. When histories of this new Cold War are written, some may ignore China's actions and argue that it was started by Donald Trump. Trump campaigned for president on the claim that China was robbing America by selling more products to the U.S. than it was buying. When I joined a few China experts to meet with Trump campaign aide Steve Bannon in 2017, he took credit for getting Trump to blame China for the loss of manufacturing jobs in states like Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, sealing Trump's victory in these swing states. After he took office, Trump sought to deliver on his campaign promise to eliminate America's trade deficit with China by imposing unilateral tariffs on imports from China. He ignored the fact that the tariffs hurt American firms manufacturing in China because he wanted them to bring their factories back home. The tariffs also raised the cost for businesses and consumers based in the U.S. Other officials in the Trump administration knew that bilateral trade deficits have little real consequences and that American firms are more likely to move their plants to Vietnam, Mexico, or Bangladesh than to Ohio. But their national security concerns made them embrace Trump's tough approach. While Trump was fixating on the bilateral trade deficit and tariffs, his administration declared China the country's greatest national security threat and mobilized a government-wide campaign to counter it. Strategic competition with China and Russia was the keystone of the Trump administration's foreign policy. For the first time, the American national security strategy openly called out China as a revisionist power, meaning a country that seeks to undermine the existing international order and eventually supplant the United States as the leading world power. In a speech he gave in October 2018, Trump's Vice President Mike Pence used the most hostile language toward Beijing of any American leader since President Nixon's historic state visit in 1972. Pence framed his speech as a wake-up call to the American people, a full-throated declaration of a global contest of values with a China that persecutes its own people and subverts the global order. The mobilization against China extended beyond the Trump administration. A bipartisan American consensus has formed around the idea that China is an adversary determined to supplant United States leadership and harm democracies. President Biden is reinforcing this consensus by declaring that Xi firmly believes that within a decade or so, China is going to own America because autocracies can make quick decisions. Biden has been framing much of his domestic as well as his foreign policy agenda as a battle between democracies and autocracies. In Congress, practically the only thing Democrats and Republicans can agree on is legislation to condemn China's actions and restrict its access to American technology. Democratic Senator Mark Warner and Republican Senator Marco Rubio, ideological antagonists, teamed up to convene sessions for counter-espionage briefing teams from the FBI and other intelligence and law enforcement agencies, their purpose being to warn universities, businesses, and state and local governments about the Chinese spies and agents operating in their midst. The National Institutes of Health, which provides the lion's share, 46%, of all federal science funding, caused the firing of a number of Chinese-American scientists when it sent letters to their universities warning about individual scientists who hadn't disclosed their research activities in China. The Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation have also forbidden their grantees from participating in the PRC's Thousand Talents program, which recruits overseas scientists and engineers to train Chinese students and undertake China-based research. China graduate students and visiting scholars in robotics, aviation, and advanced manufacturing now are only granted one-year visas, and the Commerce Department has prepared new export controls that restrict Chinese students from doing research in university and corporate laboratories that are working on emerging technologies. As this extensive campaign by the FBI, Justice Department, Department of Homeland Security, and other governmental agencies to track down and limit the access of Chinese researchers spread through American universities and research labs, ethnic Chinese scientists and engineers, American as well as Chinese or Taiwanese, came under a cloud of suspicion. Chinese Americans felt that they are being targeted by a version of the Red Scare that swept through the country during the 1950s. Blaming China for COVID-19 further inflamed public anger toward China, causing a rise in violent hate crimes against anyone who looked Asian. Many have become afraid to go out to public places for fear of being attacked. Chinese students are thinking twice about applying to American universities. As a result, the United States may be losing one of its greatest competitive advantages, namely its ability to attract and retain scientific and technological talent from China and around the world. The American government argues that China's rapid advances in such emerging dual-use technologies as artificial intelligence, digital communications, robotics, quantum computing, and biotechnology pose a grave threat to American national security. When I briefed a group of U.S. admirals, the subject they most wanted to discuss was Made in China 2025, Xi Jinping's ambitious plan to seize command of the high-tech commanding heights. The most senior admiral in the room argued for technological containment of China. We have to slow down their rise. In the past, whenever the Pentagon and the other security agencies sought to limit technology transfer to China, business groups lobbied for unrestricted commerce, and the White House struck a happy medium. Today, the business community is no longer standing up for engagement with China. Companies are fed up with Chinese regulatory shakedowns and pressures to transfer technology as the price of gaining access to China's huge market. This bargain has become less and less appealing as China's leaders have been open about their game plan to build up their own national champions to replace foreign firms. It is the rare American business executive who dares to speak out about any unfair treatment for fear of retaliation. Most of them, however, are ready to go along with a tougher U.S. government approach. Without corporate support to provide the ballast, the security and defense agency's perspective dominates America's response. Senator Mark Warner has stated his belief that the Chinese government's effort to outmaneuver the United States technologically is one of the most alarming threats we face. He is not alone. When President Trump equivocated on a proposal to ban sales of American technology to Huawei, China's leading telecom firm, which is in the vanguard with 5G digital infrastructure, Democrats and Republicans in the Senate and the House of Representatives introduced a bill that would tie Trump's hands and prevent him from making any deal that included concessions to Huawei. George Soros, a human rights philanthropist and one of the largest donors to Democratic Party candidates, called the Trump administration's tough China policy its greatest foreign policy achievement. Soros also favors restricting American investments in China. Until recently, the American public was more sanguine than the politicians about our relations with a rising China. Year after year, public opinion polls showed that roughly half of all Americans had a favorable attitude toward China and saw China as equally a rival and a partner. Pew surveys showed that American views on China turned somewhat negative after 2013, but improved again in 2017 and 2018. But in 2019, all the major opinion surveys showed a sharp increase in negative views. By 2020, according to Pew, 2/3 of Americans were unfavorable to China, a historic high and a big increase from 2 years before, 47% in 2018. As of 2022, 82% of Americans are unfavorable toward China. The coronavirus pandemic that originated in Wuhan and spread internationally during an information cover-up by Chinese government officials further damaged the country's image in the eyes of Americans. The gap between public and elite opinion is therefore closing. Both are turning more hostile toward China. Americans' perspective may be colored by worries about a loss of dominance, but other countries are also growing more suspicious of China, suggesting that its own actions are the source of the problem. A broad international backlash is snowballing. Many European Union countries are increasing scrutiny of Chinese investments to restrict access to European technology. They are also banning Huawei's 5G networks, mainly because they don't trust the Chinese government not to interfere. European public opinion is becoming more unfavorable toward China, with countries in Western and Northern Europe such as Sweden, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom being the most critical. Their positive views declined precipitously after 2018. European attitudes toward China now are hardening even more because of China's failure to distance itself from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Europeans are particularly critical of China's human rights violations. In an unprecedented move, the European Union joined Canada and the United States in March 2021 to impose sanctions on 4 Chinese officials and 1 organization responsible for abuses against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, their placement in what are being called re-education camps. After Beijing imposed retaliatory sanctions that extended to European think tanks and scholars, the European Parliament killed the comprehensive trade and investment agreement that it had recently concluded with China. Even in developing countries where China has made large loans to fund the building of dams, ports, railroads, and other infrastructure projects, many of them part of Xi Jinping's signature Belt and Road Initiative, politicians and citizens are debating whether the benefits of these projects outweigh the risks of dependency on China. Public opinion in Africa, where China has concentrated its investments, is the most positive in the world, though there has been a moderate decline in some countries. In Latin America, sizable minorities in Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina have unfavorable views of China. In every country that holds elections, ties with China have become politically controversial. Challengers go after incumbents for cozying up to China. China's Asian neighbors have experienced the sharpest decline in friendly feelings toward it, expressing the greatest worries about military aggression from China. Pew found that opinion in the Asian countries had fallen to historic lows. In South Korea, positive views fell 42% in 2022, compared with 2015. A survey of Southeast Asian elites found that they considered China the least trustworthy country in the region when compared to Japan, the European Union, the United States, and India. The percentage of elite respondents having little or no confidence in China to do the right thing when it comes to contributing to global peace, security, prosperity, and governance rose from 51.5% in 2019 to 63% in 2021. Elite distrust is particularly, and understandably, high among countries with sovereignty disputes with China, 82.1% in the Philippines and 75.4% in Vietnam. As an analyst looking at Pew results put it, almost half of all surveyed elites view China as a revisionist power with an intent to turn Southeast Asia into its sphere of influence. Australians' views also have turned much colder. When asked by the Lowy Institute whether China could be trusted to act responsibly in the world, only 23% of Australians polled in 2020 said it could, less than half the 52% who said it could in 2018. 81% of Australians now see China negatively. This is more than a popularity contest. Chinese leaders since Mao have boosted their domestic standing by touting on their billboards, "We have friends all over the world." Xi Jinping clearly relishes playing host to leaders of developing countries at lavish extravaganzas showcasing the Belt and Road Initiative, China-Africa friendship, and other diplomatic occasions. One Chinese scholar observed that Xi stands in the center of the group photographs at Belt and Road summits, whereas the American president never stands at the center of meetings of APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, an organization founded by the United States. The growing global perception is that friendship with China is no longer unconditional. Beijing rewards countries that endorse its stance on sensitive domestic issues, such as Taiwan, Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, by providing them with access to its huge market and generous investments, and it punishes countries who don't by withholding its economic favors. Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad explained in an interview in 2019 why Beijing was able to persuade 37 countries, half of them Muslim, including his own, to defend China's camps in Xinjiang at the United Nations. "You don't just try and do something which would anyway fail," as he put it, so it is better to find some other less violent ways not to antagonize China too much, because China is beneficial for us. Some domestic international relations experts acknowledge that China lacks genuine friends or allies, even among its neighbors, and that despite its being the most important economic partner of every Asian country, these countries increasingly fear China. Much as American politicians and officials in the past have periodically recriminated one another for mishandling relations with China, Chinese policy elites are asking themselves, how did China lose the West, and casting about for whom to blame. Privately, many Chinese experts blame Xi Jinping for provoking the animosity toward China. Obviously, they don't do it to the degree that foreign critics do, some of whom vilify Xi as an evil dictator bent on destroying universal values and global order. Nonetheless, President Trump had fans in China who welcomed his pressure as a check on Xi's imprudent policies. The CCP, however, has a simple explanation for why the West has turned against China. It's the inevitable outcome of the shifting balance of power, they argue, and was bound to occur as soon as the power gap between China and the U.S. narrowed. Some claim that America always turns against a country once it reaches 60% of U.S. GDP, as the Soviet Union did during the Cold War and Japan did in the 1980s. Now, it's China's turn. As China's economic, technological, and military power grows, America protects its superpower status by going all out to impede it. This mechanistic view resembles the ideas of realist international relations scholars who argue that the rise and fall of nations always causes the reigning power to exaggerate the threat, a misperception that can lead to war between it and the rising power. This pattern has been called the Thucydides trap, named for the Greek historian who chronicled Sparta's overreaction to Athens' rise, which led to the Peloponnesian War. For decades, China's leaders have recognized the risk that other countries will view their country as a threat just because of its rapid rise. In a 2015 speech in Seattle, Xi Jinping argued that there was no such thing as the so-called Thucydides trap in the world. But he went on to say that, should major countries time and again make the mistake of strategic miscalculation, they might create such traps for themselves. According to China's official media, the escalating tensions between the two countries are entirely due to America's containment policy, which is itself a strategic miscalculation. Official commentaries in People's Daily, the most authoritative source for government policy, refute erroneous views and pessimistic arguments being circulated that say that China provoked the United States by taking high-profile postures. No matter what China does, China's development endangers American primacy and leads America to re-emphasize its policy of containment, the newspaper asserts. The trade war has become a way to mobilize society for containment of China, explains the influential Chinese nationalist tabloid Global Times.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?